earlier, the prophet Isaiah wrote, "A voice cries out, in the wilderness prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God." The people to whom both Isaiah and John cried out were living in a wilderness. Not a literal wilderness, but a difficult time in their life as a nation, a time of great uncertainty, a time when it seemed that all that provided them with the security that they wanted and needed had been stripped away, and they felt vulnerable and afraid. Have you ever experienced one of those wilderness times in your life? A time when it seemed like everything that had once provided you with security was being stripped away, and you felt vulnerable and afraid. I'm certain all of you have. Maybe it was a time when someone you loved died, and you found yourself in the wilderness of loss and grief. Oftentimes, the wilderness is an illness of which the outcome is uncertain. We can experience those wilderness moments in our relationships, especially our most cherished relationships, when we're experiencing conflict, loneliness, and uncertainty about what the future of the relationship is. Financial struggles, family issues, and personal struggles we just can't seem to escape can all leave us in the wilderness with our vulnerability and fear. It seems many in our nation are feeling vulnerable and afraid because of COVID-19 and our current political situation. I spoke with someone the other day, someone that's rarely ever afraid, and someone that, takes care of themselves and others, and they're always really confident. And they sounded terrified of what's going on with the virus and everything else. And it really took me aback. I'm used to listening to people's fear and anxiety, but with this person, it was even deeper than that. It was someone who normally isn't that way. Well, wow, that must be a really bad place to be. Much of what seems to have once provided us with security in our lives together seems to have been stripped away, leaving us wonder to whom we should turn. The people to whom Isaiah and John were sent also wondered to whom they should turn during uncertain, anxious, and fearful times. I wonder if Isaiah and John were tempted to call God's people to turn to them, to promise that if they just followed them, everything would be all right, that they'd take care of all their problems. They both seemed to be very popular, and it certainly seemed they had opportunities to attract a loyal following and the power and wealth that would certainly follow. Isaiah and John were not interested in power and wealth that their popularity might afford them. Instead of calling people to follow them, they called people to turn to one who was greater than them. They called others to turn to the Lord and to prepare a way for the Lord. They called others to focus not on them, but the Lord, and prepare for the Lord's coming by the way they treated all God's people. Last week I spoke about the importance of preparing the way of the Lord by opening our hearts to God and to others, that we might give reconciliation, love, and hope a chance. While opening our hearts to God and others is important, we must also do something to prepare the way of the Lord. It's not just enough to prepare our hearts and have the right attitude. We need to take action. Action is where the buck stops. When people asked John what they should do to prepare the way of the Lord, John replied, "Whoever has 2 coats must share with anyone who has none, and whoever has food must do likewise." John told the tax collectors to not collect more than what was due them, even though they could do that. John also told the soldiers to not use their power and authority to extort money from others, and to be satisfied with their wages. Preparing the way of the Lord involves not only preparing our hearts, but the way we treat others, especially in terms of how we use our power, which is our money, and authority. Preparing the way of the Lord involves treating people fairly and sharing with all in need to make certain that everyone has what they need for joyful, abundant lives. Did you catch what preparing the way of the Lord involved for Isaiah 500 years before John? For Isaiah, preparing the way of the Lord involved building up the ancient ruins, raising up the former devastations, repairing the ruined cities, and the devastations of many generations. You see what happened to Israel because of the pursuit of power and wealth by their leaders? They'd ruined everything. I mean, they'd lost both their nations. I mean, everything had fallen apart. Preparing the way of the Lord involved rebuilding a nation built on justice, not just for the power and wealthy, but for all of God's people. God's justice includes caring for the poor, powerless, sick, widows, orphans, strangers, and everyone else who needs God's care. Isaiah's vision for preparing the way of the Lord involved rebuilding the nation of Israel, where what's most important is trusting God and each other and caring for all God's people. The way through the wilderness for God's people involves preparing the Lord by opening their hearts to God and others and rebuilding lives in the nation where what's most important are not power and wealth, but trusting God and each other and caring for all God's people. This is what we've been called to do as God's people. And like Isaiah and John the Baptist, we've been called to join our voices with them in crying out in the wildernesses of our lives, prepare the way of the Lord. Many of us are in a wilderness right now, a wilderness where we're uncertain, vulnerable, anxious, and afraid. It certainly seems that we as a nation are also in a wilderness where together we're uncertain, vulnerable, anxious, and afraid. We need to listen carefully to what we're being called to do that will lead us out of our wilderness into the hope of a new way and a better way of life. We need to open our hearts to God and each other in order to give reconciliation, love, peace, and hope a chance. We need to commit ourselves to using our power, authority, wealth, and possessions to care for others, not just ourselves. We also need to work at building a nation where what's most important is not the pursuit of power and wealth, but trusting God and each other and caring for all God's people, and pursuing the justice that involves caring for the poor, powerless, sick, widows, orphans, strangers, and everyone else. They're all God's children, just like us. Many of us are living in the wilderness where we're uncertain, vulnerable, anxious, and afraid. However, there is good news. The good news is that Isaiah, John the Baptist, Jesus, and countless others have shown us the way out of the wilderness. May we be faithful in following where they are leading as we lift our voices and cry in our wildernesses, prepare the way of the Lord, and then to do so by opening our hearts to others and reaching out to treat everyone with the love and care God has called to bless them with. Amen.